The Battle of Midway was a crucial and decisive naval battle in the Pacific theater of World War II. Between 3 and 7 June 1942, only 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States Navy under Admirals Chester Nimitz, Frank Jack Fletcher, and Raymond A. Spruance decisively defeated an attacking fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy under Admirals Isoroku Yamamoto, Chuichi Nagumo, and Nobutake Kondo near Midway Atoll, inflicting devastating damage on the Japanese fleet that proved irreparable. Military historian John Keegan called it the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. The operation, like the earlier attack on Pearl Harbor, sought to eliminate the United States as a strategic power in the Pacific, thereby giving Japan a free hand in establishing its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The Japanese hoped another demoralizing defeat would force the U.S. to capitulate in the Pacific War and thus ensure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Luring the American aircraft carriers into a trap and occupying Midway was part of an overall barrier strategy to extend Japan's defensive perimeter. In response to the Doolittle air raid on Tokyo, this operation was also considered preparatory for further attacks against Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii itself. The plan was handicapped by faulty Japanese assumptions of the American reaction and poor initial dispositions. Most significantly, American codebreakers were able to determine the date and location of the planned attack, enabling the forewarned U.S. Navy to prepare its own ambush. All 4 of Japan's large aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hoyu, part of the 6 carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and a heavy cruiser were sunk, while the U.S. lost only the carrier Yorktown and a destroyer. After Midway and the exhausting attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, Japan's capacity to replace its losses in materiel and men rapidly became insufficient to cope with mounting casualties, while the United States' massive industrial and training capabilities made losses far easier to replace. The Battle of Midway is considered a turning point in the Pacific War. Background: after expanding the war in the Pacific to include Western outposts, the Japanese Empire had attained its initial strategic goals quickly, taking the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The latter, with its vital oil resources, was particularly important to Japan. Because of this, preliminary planning for a second phase of operations commenced as early as January 1942. There were strategic disagreements between the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy, and infighting between the Navy's GHQ and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet, and a follow-up strategy was not formed until April 1942. Admiral Yamamoto finally succeeded in winning the bureaucratic struggle with a thinly veiled threat to resign, after which his plan for the Central Pacific was adopted. Yamamoto's primary strategic goal was the elimination of America's carrier forces, which he regarded as the principal threat to the overall Pacific campaign. This concern was acutely heightened by the Doolittle raid on 18 April 1942, in which 16 U.S. Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from US Hornet bombed targets in Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The raid, while militarily insignificant, was a shock to the Japanese and showed the existence of a gap in the defenses around the Japanese home islands as well as the accessibility of Japanese territory to American bombers. This, and other successful hit-and-run raids by American carriers in the South Pacific, showed that they were still a threat. Although seemingly reluctant to be drawn into an all-out battle, Yamamoto reasoned that another air attack on the main U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor would induce all of the American fleet to sail out to fight, including the carriers. However, due to the increased strength of American land-based air power on the Hawaiian Islands since the December 7 attack the previous year, he judged that it was now too risky to attack Pearl Harbor directly. Instead, Yamamoto selected Midway, a tiny atoll at the extreme northwest end of the Hawaiian island chain, approximately 1,300 miles from Oahu. This meant that Midway was outside the effective range of almost all of the American aircraft stationed on the main Hawaiian islands. Midway was not especially important in the larger scheme of Japan's intentions, but the Japanese felt the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost of Pearl Harbor and would therefore be compelled to defend it vigorously. The U.S. did consider Midway vital. After the battle, establishment of a U.S. submarine base on Midway allowed submarines operating from Pearl Harbor to refuel and re-provision, extending their radius of operations by 1,200 miles. In addition to serving as a seaplane base, Midway's airstrips also served as a forward staging point for bomber attacks on Wake Island. Yamamoto's plan. Operation Me. Typical of Japanese naval planning during World War II, Yamamoto's battle plan was exceedingly complex, requiring the careful and timely coordination of multiple battle groups over hundreds of miles of open sea. His design was predicated on optimistic intelligence suggesting that US Enterprise and US Hornet, forming Task Force 16, were the only carriers available to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. During the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, US Lexington had been sunk and US Yorktown damaged so severely that the Japanese believed she too had been lost. Yorktown deployed, after being hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, and played a critical role in the discovery and eventual destruction of the Japanese fleet carriers at Midway. Much of Yamamoto's planning, coinciding with the general feeling among the Japanese leadership at the time, was based on a gross misjudgment of American morale, which was believed to be debilitated from the string of Japanese victories in the preceding months. Yamamoto felt deception would be required to lure the U.S. fleet into a fatally compromised situation. To this end, he dispersed his forces so that their full extent would be unlikely to be discovered by the Americans prior to battle. Critically, Yamamoto's supporting battleships and cruisers trailed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumu's carrier force by several hundred miles. Japan's heavy surface forces were intended to destroy whatever elements of the U.S. fleet might come to Midway's defense once Nagumu's carriers had weakened them sufficiently for a daylight gun duel. This was typical of the battle doctrine of most major navies at the time. What Yamamoto did not know was that the U.S. had broken the main Japanese naval code. His emphasis on dispersal also meant none of his formations were in a position to support each other. For instance, despite the fact Nagumu's carriers were expected to carry out strikes against Midway and bear the brunt of American counterattacks, the only warships in his fleet, larger than the screening force of 12 destroyers, were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 1 light cruiser. By contrast, Yamamoto and Kondo had between them 2 light carriers, 5 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers, none of which saw action at Midway. The battleships and the small carriers of the trailing force were unable to keep pace with the carriers of the Kido Butai, and so could not have sailed in company with them. While the distance between Yamamoto and Kondo's forces and Nagumu's carriers had grave implications during the battle, the invaluable reconnaissance capability of the scout planes carried by the cruisers and carriers in the trailing force was denied Nagumu. The additional anti-aircraft capability of the cruisers would also have benefited Nagumu. Illusion invasion. In order to obtain support from the Imperial Japanese Army for the Midway operation, the Imperial Japanese Navy agreed to support their invasion of the Aleutian Islands. The IJA wished to occupy the western Aleutians to place the Japanese home islands out of range of U.S. land-based bombers based in Alaska. The Japanese operations in the Aleutian Islands removed yet more ships that could otherwise have augmented the force striking Midway. whereas many earlier historical accounts considered the Aleutians operation as a feint to draw American forces away. Early 21st century research has suggested that AL was intended to be launched simultaneously with the attack on Midway. A one-day delay in the sailing of Nagumo's task force resulted in Operation AL beginning a day before the Midway attack. Prelude. American reinforcements to do battle with an enemy expected to muster for all 5 carriers. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean areas, needed every available U.S. flight deck. He already had Vice Admiral William Halsey's 2-carrier task force at hand, though Halsey was stricken with dermatitis and had to be replaced by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, Halsey's escort commander. Nimitz also hurriedly recalled Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force, including the carrier Yorktown, from the Southwest Pacific area. Despite estimates that Yorktown would require several months of repairs at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, her elevators were intact and her flight deck largely so. The Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard worked around the clock, and in 72 hours she was restored to a battle-ready state, judged good enough for 2 or 3 weeks of operations, as Nimitz required. Her flight deck was patched, whole sections of internal frames were cut out and replaced. Repairs continued even as she sortied, with work crews from the repair ship US Vestal, herself damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, still aboard. Yorktown's partially depleted air group was rebuilt using whatever planes and pilots could be found. The dive and torpedo squadrons were replaced with those from US Saratoga, with Yorktown's own dive bomber squadron remaining in the scout bomber role. The fighter squadron was reformed with new F-4 Wildcat aircraft and aircrew drawn from Saratoga. In addition, surviving pilots from US Lexington, under the command of Lexington's Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, were also assigned to Yorktown. Some of the aircrew were inexperienced, which may have contributed to an accident in which Thatcher's executive officer was killed. Despite efforts to get Saratoga ready for the coming engagement, the need to resupply and assemble sufficient escorts meant that she was not able to reach Midway until after the battle. On Midway, by the 4th of June the USN had stationed 4 squadrons of PBYs, 31 aircraft in total, for long-range reconnaissance duties, and 6 brand-new TBF-1 Avengers, the latter a detachment from Hornet, SVT-8. The Marine Corps stationed 19 Solomon Islands Dauntlesses, 7 F-4 F-3 Wildcats, 17 SB-2U-3 Vindicators, and 21 F-2A-3s. The USAAF contributed a squadron of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 8 B-26 Marauders equipped with torpedoes. In total 126 aircraft. Although the F-2s and SB-2s were already obsolete, they were the only aircraft available to the Marine Corps at the time. Japanese shortcomings during the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier. The Japanese light carrier Shoho had been sunk and the fleet carrier Shokaku had sustained 3 bomb hits, and was in dry dock undergoing repairs. Although the carrier Zuikaku escaped the battle undamaged, she had lost almost half her air group, and was in port in Kure awaiting replacement planes and pilots. That there were none immediately available is attributable to the failure of the IJN crew training program, which already showed signs of being unable to replace losses. Instructors from the Yokosuka Air Corps were employed in an effort to make up the shortfall. Historians Partial and Tully believe that by combining the surviving aircraft and pilots from Shokaku and Zuikaku, it is likely that Zuikaku could have been equipped with almost a full composite air group. They also note that doing so would have violated Japanese carrier doctrine, which stressed that carriers and the pilots must train as a single unit. In any case, the Japanese apparently made no serious attempt to get Zuikaku ready for the forthcoming battle. Thus, Carrier Division 5, consisting of the two most advanced aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, would not be available, which meant that Admiral Nagumo had to rely on 4 fleet carriers, Kaga and Akagi forming Carrier Division 1 and Hoyu and Soru as Carrier Division 2. At least part of this was due to fatigue. Japanese carriers had been constantly on operation since the 7th of December 1941, including raids on Darwin and Colombo. The main Japanese carrier-borne strike aircraft were the D-3A-1 Val dive bomber and the B-5N-2 Kate, which was used either as a torpedo bomber or as a level bomber. The main carrier fighter was the fast and highly maneuverable A-6M-0. For a variety of reasons, production of the Val had been drastically reduced while that of the Kate had been stopped completely, and, as a consequence, there were none available to replace losses. In addition, many of the aircraft being used during the June 1942 operations had been operational since late November 1941 and, although they were well maintained, many were almost worn out and had become increasingly unreliable. These factors meant all carriers of the Kido Butai had fewer aircraft than their normal complement, with few spare aircraft or parts stored in the carriers' hangars. Japanese strategic scouting arrangements prior to the battle were also in disarray. A picket line of Japanese submarines was late getting into position, which let the American carriers reach their assembly point northeast of Midway without being detected. A second attempt at reconnaissance, using 4-engine H-8K Emily flying boats to scout Pearl Harbor prior to the battle and detect whether the American carriers were present, part of Operation K, was thwarted when Japanese submarines assigned to refuel the search aircraft discovered that the intended refueling point, a hitherto deserted bay off French frigate Shoals, was now occupied by American warships, because the Japanese had carried out an identical mission in March. Thus, Japan was deprived of any knowledge concerning the movements of the American carriers immediately before the battle. Japanese radio intercepts did notice an increase in both American submarine activity and message traffic. This information was in Yamamoto's hands prior to the battle. Japanese plans were not changed. Yamamoto, at sea, and Yamato assumed Nagumo had received the same signal from Tokyo, and did not communicate with him by radio, so as not to reveal his position. These messages were, contrary to earlier historical accounts, also received by Nagumo before the battle began. For reasons which remain unclear, Nagumo did not alter his plans or take additional precautions. Allied code-breaking Admiral Nimitz had one priceless advantage. U.S. cryptanalysts had partially broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Since early 1942, the U.S. had been decoding messages stating that there would soon be an operation at Objective AF. It was not known where AF was, but Commander Joseph J. Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo were able to confirm that it was Midway. Captain Wilfred Holmes devised a ruse of telling the base at Midway to broadcast an uncoded radio message stating that Midway's water purification system had broken down. Within 24 hours, the code breakers picked up a Japanese message that AF was short on water. No Japanese radio operators who intercepted the message seemed concerned that the Americans were broadcasting that a major naval installation close to the Japanese threat ring was having a water shortage uncoded, which could have tipped off Japanese intelligence officers that it was a deliberate attempt at deception. Hypo was also able to determine the date of the attack as either 4 or the 5th of June, and to provide Nimitz with a complete IJN order of battle. Japan had a new code book, but its introduction had been delayed, enabling Hypo to read messages for several crucial days. The new code which had not yet been cracked, came into use on the 24th of May, but the important breaks had already been made. As a result, the Americans entered the battle with a very good picture of where, when, and in what strength the Japanese would appear. Nimitz knew that the Japanese had negated their numerical advantage by dividing their ships into 4 separate task groups, all too widely separated to be able to support each other. This dispersal resulted in few fast ships being available to escort the carrier striking force, limiting the numbers of anti-aircraft guns able to protect the carriers. Nimitz calculated that the aircraft on his 3 carriers, plus those on Midway Island, gave the U.S. rough parity with Yamamoto's 4 carriers, mainly because American carrier air groups were larger than Japanese ones. The Japanese, by contrast, remained almost totally unaware of their opponent's true strength and dispositions even after the battle began.